we need to look at why is that happening? And at the systemic level, or at the level of the society and the culture, we see a lot of messages that objectify women, and that means turning a person into an object. And there's a big difference between making somebody an object and honoring the fact that they are the subject of their own life, the one engaging the action. So if we think about women being objectified, what we're actually talking about is women being turned into objects that are acted upon, rather than being honored and respected as subjects who engage action. That becomes a problem at the personal level, because it becomes very difficult to be in a respectful relationship with something you perceive as an object rather than a subject. It's important that we recognize each other as whole human beings in order to begin to engage that individual level of care and compassion and respect. The other piece that happens at the social level or at the cultural level is this idea of stigma, that sex work itself is not actually violent, that the violence comes from the stigma and the shame that the society places on sex workers. It makes people vulnerable to violence. So if people are shamed and hidden in the community, they're not allowed to interact with the rest of the community openly, they're tucked off into industrial corners of the city, then it means that they're separate from the rest of the community. It means that there's a certain group in our community that is not kept safe by the common care that we all hold for each other. So if you and I are walking down the street and somebody hurts you, I'm going to see it and I'll call for help. If you're alone in an industrial corner of the city and somebody hurts you, first of all, nobody will see it. And if somebody does, and that other person is also somebody who is stigmatized or isolated from the community, they're also going to be afraid to call for help. So when we look at that larger image of what happens when people are stigmatized, that person is often punished through shunning if the violation is serious enough. And throughout history, what that has meant is that a person becomes isolated and alone out in the wider world. And in times when we were less industrialized, it meant people were vulnerable to predators like wild animals and other people. But they were also vulnerable to death through heartache, through just the slow death of alienation and loss of relationship. Today, that same action happens when we cast people out to the perimeters of our community. So how does that relate to my daughter or your daughter or your son or a child who isn't clear what their gender orientation is? How does that relate? Well, it looks like this. On a playground or in a high school or even in an office, somebody, typically a woman, might be exposed as a gay person, as a transgender person, as a sex worker. Maybe it's something else. So society is always actually changing the rules of what is most acceptable around sexual behavior. So really, we're pretty much always guessing what's that going to be. But whatever it is, the community tends to pick a group and say, this is the group that will be ostracized. And if you do anything like that, you will be ostracized too. That's the threat. So when we see sex workers in our community being alienated and ostracized to the point where they can be hunted, that sends a message to our young people that if somebody behaves in a way that's considered outside the norm, or is even rumored to behave in a way that's outside the norm sexually, that person, that it's permissible to shun and stigmatize that person to the point where they are bullied and punished, sometimes until they commit suicide or until something in the wider community harms them very much. So this idea of shunning and stigma is a very big idea. It's very real. We can see it play out in the bigger community, but critically to any of us who are parents or teachers or who have responsibility for young people, and to any of us who are engaged in response when people have been harmed. We need to recognize that it's not how somebody dresses. It's not whether or not somebody was drunk. What it comes down to is what happens when we as a wider community tolerate stigma and harm, which then makes people vulnerable to having violence acted out against them. Beyond making people vulnerable to violence, it leaves people reluctant to report violence. So the fear against letting people know that you need help because somebody has taken advantage of their power or their relationship role in your life is very, very high. And it means that we need to brace ourselves for the reality that there are probably people in our lives who will either on purpose or out of stupidity and ignorance, by mistake or out of a drunken stumbling, cause harm to a young person. And that young person is very unlikely to want to report it because of their own fear of being cast out of a family, of being ostracized and alienated. And we need to educate ourselves so that we can understand that sometimes good people do very, very bad things, and we need to find our way through that as a community, and that harm is only stopped if we listen to the people who've been hurt. We can only hear them if we're willing to hear past the fear and the repulsion that comes up in us because of the training we've had through pop culture and through the media to see stigma and this idea that tells us we should alienate and shut people out.